Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana is in Washington ahead of the spring meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank later this week, as the global community seeks to build back better amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, a recovery complicated, of course, by the war in Ukraine and trepidation about the continued impact of climate change.
Now, Minister Godongwana spoke yesterday with the SABC's Sherwin Bryce-Pease in a conversation that explores the state of the South African economy, its debt burden, unemployment, and the developing disaster situations in KwaZulu-Natal and elsewhere.
Minister Enoch Godongwana, welcome back to SABC News. It's good to see you.
Good to see you as well. Sure.
The annual spring meetings come at a perilous moment for the world, where both its peace and security architecture and the global financial architecture is coming in for particular strain, for particular scrutiny, and for particular criticism, Minister. What are your expectations as you now prepare for what is being seen as a very key meeting of the IMF and the World Bank in Washington this week?
I think there will be recurring themes in Washington this week. Key among those would be debt sustainability. As you are aware, within the G20, we agreed on what is called the common framework. We'll come back to that in a moment, whose particular emphasis is debt suspension for the specific countries. The second set of issues will be the climate change issues, which is an important point. You know, we've just come out from Glasgow on COP26. The key question, how are we going to move forward with adaptation and mitigation? The developed world have promised in the past. Some of those have not been able to fulfill those promises. As I suspect that's likely to be a major debate as well. And also, COVID-19 is likely to continue to be with us. And key among those issues is the notion of continual access by the emerging economies and vulnerable economies to the vaccine and the necessary supports.
I've got all those three on my list, Minister, so we'll get to them in time. Let's begin with the South African economy. IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva told me last week that the South African economy is being underutilized. It has underutilized potential. I'm quoting from an IMF release in February here. South Africa's subpar economic performance over the last decade has weakened its macroeconomic fundamentals and social indicators. They say that the recovery we have seen post the contraction brought on by COVID-19 is unlikely to be sustained. What do you, sir, see as the fundamentals from getting South Africa out of this low growth trap?
I think first and foremost, there's a common understanding that on the issues confronting the South African economy and our nation, amongst those has been the poor performance of this economy over a decade. We make the point in the budget speech that, in fact, it has been declining for over a decade. COVID-19 has exacerbated the problem. So we have challenges, and we saw in the last quarter of last year, the economy began to pick up. We anticipate that is going to be 2.1% growth, but that's not sufficient to absorb the growing unemployment in our society. So we're embarked on a number of key structural programs which we think will deal with the growth challenges. Key amongst those is to deal with the perennial problem of electricity shortages, deal with the cost of data through spectrum, deal with skills shortage in two ways, both in importing skills where we don't have them, and on the supply side, begin to increase skills in the economy. So there's a whole range of a raft of measures who are intended to change the economic trajectory.
Minister, part of that reskilling, right, is about building a resilient economy. The IMF also talks about the need for developing economies to build resilience for the next shocks that we all know are coming. Right now, we have a pandemic which remains a clear and present danger. The war in Ukraine could have long-term consequences for the global economy. And then natural disasters like the one being experienced in KwaZulu-Natal. Add to that, of course, concern around corruption. You talk about power cuts. that weigh on social outcomes, including rising poverty in South Africa, the prevailing sense, Minister, is that the country is one or two shocks away from chaos, elements of which we saw manifest itself in parts of the country last year. Am I being too pessimistic?
Look, there are a number of people who have written our obituary. But eventually we have not reached that point. My sense is that we accept that we're facing structural challenges as an economy, and we're working very hard to change them. We've had challenges amongst them, which has exacerbated those challenges, as I've indicated, the COVID-19, the KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng unrest last year. We've had now the conflict in Ukraine, which is creating a major fuel prices, food prices, the current challenges which we have. We've had serious disaster in KZN and Eastern Cape. Last night, we had fires in Western Cape, which displaced about 300 people. So those are the challenges which I begin to see them as just speed bumps as we're trying to resuscitate the economy. I think we're building a number of things that will make us resilient. For instance, key amongst those, from where I sit as a Minister of Finance, is a fiscal space. And I think we're beginning to develop that. The President is going to announce this evening some measures which we are taking to deal with those disasters. Had we not created the fiscal space, we would not be able to respond in the manner we do.
Look, and let's get credit where credit is due. Moodys, of course, affirming South Africa's BA2 rating, but changing the outlook to stable. And they cite that over the last 2 fiscal years, the government has shown it was able to reprioritize its spending while staying committed to fiscal consolidation. So credit where credit is due. I argue, though, that KZN is not just a speed bump, but a punch in the gut. Given the context that I've laid out, there's over 10 billion rands worth of damage. I think we've heard from the government that they are putting 1 billion on the table so far. But where is the money going to come back to build back better, given that we are just now beginning to see light at the end of the tunnel in terms of the fiscal consolidation you talk of?
Let me just say, I mean, part of the usefulness of some of these things, I said the key activity which we did from a fiscal point of perspective is create a fiscal space. For instance, the disaster has got 2 kind of phases. The first one is what we call an immediate relief. Immediate relief composed of 2 components. The first one is to move people that are into, for instance, housing, relief, water, and so on. So the second component of that is to assess the extent of the damage. We've got more than R1 billion, which was budgeted in any event, showing our fiscal space. The second phase is going to be recovery and repair. And again, my view is that we've had better than expected revenue as a result of the commodity prices. And that trend, in my view, is still going. So we're quite comfortably going to be able to overcome the disaster that are facing us at the moment.
And SARS also doing an amazing job in that sense. Minister, the World Bank says structural challenges and weak growth have undermined progress in reducing poverty, which have been heightened by the COVID-19 pandemic. The achievement of progress in household welfare is severely constrained by, as you mentioned, rising unemployment, which reached an unprecedented 35.3% in the fourth quarter of 2021. The unemployment rate is highest among youth aged between 15 and 24. That's at around 66.5%. Given the role that the private sector has here, has the state, as President Ramaphosa referred to in his State of the Nation address, created an environment in which the private sector can invest and unleash the dynamism we know this economy has? Let
me just say first, a positive aspect about unemployment. The people have not mentioned the positive part of it. If you look at what has happened in unemployment in South Africa, because that was the last quarter, normally in the last quarter, there are no new entrants into the market. What we have seen is a migration of people from the disgruntled group, people who are no longer interested in looking for jobs, moving into active employment, searching for jobs, and therefore pushing the unemployment, the encouraged group higher. So the fact that people are beginning to have positive and look for jobs, it does a sound signal. The same thing about a private sector. I've mentioned the fact that we are doing a couple of things. First, on the generator side of electricity, we've thrown that open, bringing in private sector to help in providing electricity. We've made available about 100 megawatts free available for companies, less regulation. We've allowed municipalities to buy directly from these things so that they overcome the issue of electricity and increase private sector. We've then also moved into Transnet has announced at the beginning of this month that we're also bringing in private sector participation in the rail space. We've already done that in the port space. We have already auctioned spectrum. We're doing a whole range of things practically to attract private sector participation.
Minister, you mentioned the issue of debt at the beginning of this conversation. It's obviously a big talking point, particularly as a result of COVID-19. South Africa received a loan of 4.3 billion from the IMF in 2020, with the institution saying at the time that there was a pressing need to strengthen economic fundamentals and ensure debt sustainability by carrying out fiscal consolidation and structural reforms, things you've just been addressing with us. Another World Bank loan of $750 million in January this year, and a $1 billion loan from the New Development Bank in April last year. We must also note, Minister, that Moodys has praised, the government recently for its fiscal consolidation, but certainly globally debt levels are a huge concern. Is it as big of a concern for you?
No. Let me tell you why. We have a formula. We have a formula which is standard of the composition of debt between domestic and foreign. What are the implications of that? Is that in the event of currency fluctuation, we do not have a major exposure. So debt is, to us, is not a problem, foreign debt. But as I'm saying, if you look at the fiscal consolidation, is informed by a fiscal strategy and debt management. So we are saying by the time we reach 2024, our debt would have stabilized at about 75%.
Yeah, that's what I was talking to the IMF managing director about as well. The only concern around that is that you don't know where the next external shock is going to come from and whether you would need to make another loan or not. Am I wrong in that assessment?
Those issues are always risk. Let me give you an indication. I tabled my budget on the 23rd of February. As I woke up on the 24th, there's a conflict in Ukraine. Something which was unpredicted the previous day. Yeah. So risk remain as in the system, and you must always be flexible and see how you can manage those risks.
Has the G20 debt service suspension initiative gone far enough?
It's not going far. It's not going far. Let me just say why it's not going far. We have supported the framework of the G20. The first thing that is a problem is that only 3 countries have applied for it. That's the first problem, which means there's some reservations amongst a number of countries about the implications of availing themselves for this facility. So that's problem area number 1. Problem area number 2 is that there's even difficulty in finalizing these 3, bottlenecks in finalizing these 3. With those 2 are giving us a sense of discomfort as South Africa.
Why?
Look, my sense is that there's a disagreement amongst the tech creditors themselves on the approach to be adopted on this matter, given their exposure. I suspect that there's different approaches, given that the countries are not exposed in the same manner on this to this debt suspension.
The UN Secretary General also called for interest rates surcharges to be suspended for 2 years. Is that something you can get behind?
It's something we would welcome. Whether the Paris Club and other creditors would agree with such a proposal it's a matter of conjunction. So, but South Africa would probably support that.
We also hear, Minister, that there has been a reallocation of the $400 billion in SDRs that went to some of the most developed economies in the world that didn't need that as a result of COVID-19. And some of that money is going into what they're now calling a resilience and sustainability trust, primarily to help countries that are struggling to shift to low climate resilient economies, countries like South Africa. And just given what we are seeing in KwaZulu-Natal, in terms of this transition, will we require the requisite financing and the reskilling of workers who now populate the fossil fuel industry? Will we need more money for that reskilling in terms of moving the thousands and tens of thousands of workers that are employed in the fossil fuel industry? Would a trust like this benefit that kind of transition?
No. Let's draw a distinction between these two. Draw a distinction. This trust arises out of a debate. You'll remember that last year the IMF provided a facility called the SDR to all its member states. South Africa was a beneficiary as well. So even the developed world are also a beneficiary of the SDRs. The argument is a majority of the countries, particularly in the developed world, don't need these SDRs.
Right.
And therefore, they must make these SDRs available to countries that need it. And therefore, this resilient and sustainability trust has been created as an instrument to give effect to that. So that's a separate issue. There's a second issue, which is just transition, to which the South African debate comes into. South Africa then says, we are transition. As you are aware, we have got 90% of our electricity coming from coal, right? What that means, and the unfortunate part is that there's a high concentration of those facilities that provide electricity from coal to one specific province, that is in Mpumalanga. 13 Eskom power stations and 13 mines are there. Most of the people that are employed in the mines and the power stations are in that area. So if we're going to be talking about a movement from coal and to renewable energies, then we've got to find an alternative development strategy from Mpumalanga in such a manner that we can improve the livelihoods of those communities as a result of the loss of jobs arising from the mining and coal power stations.
So it begs the question, Minister, given what you've just laid out, right? Essentially, this is about people and their livelihoods and being able to transition to and reskilling for the green economy. Is net zero by 2050, which is a big sort of emblem that the United Nations likes to put out. They also say no new power stations after 2021. Is that a pipe dream in the South African context?
Let me just point out part of this transition, there's a just component to it. You know? And the just component, it talks about the impact on communities and workers. What that means, when the developed world, when we agreed with the developed world on this just transition, part of what was agreed was that there will be funding flowing through the developing countries to assist them to deal with this just component of this transition. So that is one of the important points what we're trying to deal with. Of importance for us in this particular meeting is to get a better sense and understanding. You will recall during the COP26 in Glasgow, there was $8.5 billion which was towed around for South Africa, is to begin to have a handle and on those issues, to have a better sense of what actually is going to happen. So we are as keen as you in terms of how these negotiations are going to, the outcome of these discussions are going to look like.
Minister, so good to talk with you. Thanks for making time for SABC. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Enoch Godongwana, South Africa's Minister of Finance, speaking to me from Washington, where he's due to attend the annual spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank later this week. Always a pleasure.
All right.
Yeah.
Of course, we come to the end of the show, Francis.
Yeah, that's a finance minister dealing with predictions that South Africa's economy will grow well below even the African average, sub-Saharan Africa and world average. Lots of issues. Thank you for that, Sherwin, and thank you for being with us on the show tonight. See you same time, same place tomorrow.
And Oli is up next. She'll, of course, be bringing you the very latest on that draw happening tonight, as we want to know who Bafana Bafana will be.